Good afternoon. Welcome to my third of these online nutrition talks. This is a rerun of the third talk, because I forgot to press the record button the first time through. So hopefully this goes as well as the first time did. So these talks now are becoming quite reactionary. I'm responding to emails and conversations I'm having following each talk, and today is no exception with that. And the main point of today's talk was to address a couple of questions I've had, and I often have this question with regard to dietary change. We have this model of dietary change which is primarily driven by weight loss. People are overweight or obese, and they want to bring about a change to that, and that's when often they resort to dietary change. Putting that the other way around, then, people who are perhaps more of normal weight or have very little extra weight to carry, why should they have a dietary change? And certainly if that dietary change is quite a radical change to their normal way of eating, then of course the motivation for that change needs a lot of convincing, it needs a lot of explanation. So the purpose of today's talk, But I'm Not Fat, the Case for Dietary Change, is to really address why, what are the benefits, what is going on, why are the benefits from changing diet. So let me do that. As always, I've got a selection of slides, so let me start the slideshow for that. And let's move this into play mode here. So this is the title of the talk, But I'm Not Fat, the Case for Dietary Change. I'm going to start the first slide of this one, a sort of slightly jokey slide, but in its essence exemplifies that very problem I've just described. Very often, being overweight, being obese is a very visual thing. Because it's visual, we're very conscious of it. So people, therefore, are hugely motivated for dietary change when they know, or they're convinced, or they believe that it's going to bring about weight loss because it'll improve their weight. But very often what happens is that we then get the yo-yo diet, because people, they make a dietary change, it brings about improvement in their body fat, their body weight. They then let the dietary change revert, or their diet revert back to their previous way of eating. They then put weight on again, and they go through a cycle of instigating dietary change to lose the weight, go back to the old way of eating, gain the weight, change to dieting, lose the weight, and so on. So we get the yo-yo dieting. What I want to address here are the metabolic evidence that actually it's not just about weight, that very often, and indeed in many of the situations we have at the moment with regard to coronavirus infection, actually a lot is to do with the health of the individual, which might not just be shown by the individual being overweight or obese. And I'm going to start that with my own personal journey, my own personal story. 4 or 5 years ago, it was the big thing for all of us to have NutriBullets, these high-speed blenders that mash down usually fruit and vegetables into a drink, a quite thick smoothie type drink, to give us a good nutrient load. So into a smoothie might go kale, spinach, fruit juices, and so on, maybe a bit of yogurt to give a nice rich smoothie drink, and it's full of nutrients. And it was the thing 4 or 5 years ago. And I likewise bought one of these NutriBullets and got into the daily habit of having one of these smoothies every morning. But then I found something very, very odd. Reproducibly and very consistently, within 45 minutes or an hour of having one of these smoothies, I would feel dog tired, absolutely exhausted. And as I say, it was reproducible, predictable, always within 45 minutes to an hour of having one of these smoothies. I knew, therefore, something wasn't right. And with my knowledge of metabolism at the time, I thought there's something wrong here with my sugar metabolism. I'm getting a sugar crash following having one of these smoothies. Of course, what a smoothie is, there's a lot of carbohydrate in a smoothie from the fruit and the vegetable you're putting in, all natural carbohydrates, of course, are mostly natural carbohydrates. But making the smoothie, putting it into the high-power blender breaks down these carbohydrates, making the sugars within the drink very easily accessible with my body. So I wondered, is my sugar metabolism up to the job with dealing with this sudden high load of sugar coming into the system? So what I chose to do was take a radical view with my diet and say, right, I'm going to take all or most sugars out of my diet. And what I chose to do was, and this example labeling here gives you an idea, is that wherever food had labeling, if a food was more than 5 grams per 100 grams sugar, I wasn't going to eat it. So if we look at this particular food here, it's 73.8 grams carbohydrates. This is a very high carbohydrate food, of which 15 grams of those are sugars. That's 15% sugar. So I wouldn't have eaten this particular food. And as I say, I changed this so that, or I decided on a rule that if this number here was 5 or more, I wasn't going to eat the food. And I did that very successfully. And I haven't really gone back to eating sugar since, even though this was a good number of years ago. But within just the space of a couple of months, within the space of 8 weeks, from this eating the smoothies, noticing the pattern, taking out sugar, and then 8 weeks later, I noticed my weight went from 83 kilos to 72 kilos. That's a loss of about 22, 23 pounds in weight. Now, throughout all of that, though, the fit of my jeans, my waist size according to my jeans, stayed the same. I stayed a 32-inch waist size. Admittedly, I probably started off before the weight loss at a snug 32-inch, and by the end of the weight loss, I was a loose 32-inch. But essentially, I didn't really lose a lot of visible fat from around my waist. And that then begs the question, well, what's going on here? Because the typical pattern of people who take on a diet, and I mean diet in the sense of bring about change in something, be that usually weight. I didn't look fat to start with. I didn't then become slimmer. So what was going on here? Where did this 22, 23 pounds of weight loss come from that I lost within the 8 weeks of cutting sugar out of my diet? And so this set me on my dietary journey in terms of my research, my nutritional research with what's going on with my diet. And it leads us very nicely into something that's very, very current. This is a headline from last Monday in one of the electronic newspapers. And it was in response to coronavirus and the observation that a lot of the comorbidities that are being identified with coronavirus, be that obesity, type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, patients with those comorbidities, and indeed with many of those comorbidities, were far more likely to have poorer outcomes with COVID-19. And the article that appeared in the media on Monday talked about the root cause of these. So rather than thinking of obesity, diabetes and high blood pressure as separate conditions, it was examining the root cause of all of these. And if you read on the article, it talked about this root cause, but the root cause we're talking about is the one that underlies the three conditions identified there: obesity, diabetes, and high blood pressure. And in the paper, it was called Metabolic Syndrome. So metabolic syndrome was seen as the root cause of all of those. And as I will be describing in this talk here, that is also known as insulin resistance. I'm going to talk about those two relatively interchangeable terms, but the key thing is they are both the root cause of obesity, diabetes, and high blood pressure, and therefore they are the root cause that is correlated with poor COVID-19 outcomes. So that condition, insulin resistance metabolic syndrome, affects your immune system. It gives you impaired immunity. And of course, that's a critical distinction in a time when there's a pandemic of infection in the country. So that is the starting point of the talk. The structure of the talk is in 5 sections actually, but the 4 for the main part of the talk, I'm going to use an analogy to describe how the body's metabolism works and what goes wrong when we get metabolic syndrome. For that, I'm going to use an analogy. I'm calling it the human hybrid. The human hybrid model talks about something called insulin resistance. And to give that a context, to give that an explanation, I need to talk about what insulin is, how insulin works. I will then talk to you about when insulin goes wrong. What happens in insulin resistance? What's the pathology? What's the problem with insulin that causes the condition known as insulin resistance? And then give you some information about knowing, does that apply to you? How would you know if you had this thing called insulin resistance? So let's start that with my first part, the analogy. And I'm going to introduce you to Herbie the hybrid car. And Herbie the hybrid car can run on 2 sources of fuel: petrol or electricity. So a true hybrid in the modern sense. It's got an ability to run off electricity for a while and then revert to petrol. Both of those sources of fuel give the car energy. So both of those can be used by Herbie to make the car go. And to give you some relativities here, which is relevant when I move the analogy back to humans, in Herbie, the typical range of the electric part of the mechanism is 50 miles. But from petrol, it's 500 miles. So we've got much more duration out of our petrol fuel tank, but we still get a reasonable amount out of the electricity fuel tank as well. Now, the way Herbie normally works is that when he's doing his thing, he will pull from electricity first. So if he's got 50 miles left in his electricity tank, he will use that. Once that's depleted, he will then switch to the petrol tank and then start using petrol for the remainder of whatever journey is being required of it. When that's reached a point of an end, go to a fuel station, recharge the electricity, fill up the petrol tank again, and we can go through the cycle again. But I want you to imagine Herbie now has a problem. Once he's depleted his electricity, rather than switching to the petrol, a warning sign comes up saying he's empty. Because the battery, the electricity tank is now empty, rather than switching to fuel, a warning sign comes on saying, that's it, you can't go any further. So what we'll do is go back to the petrol station or go back to the charging point, recharge the electricity, and then go through the cycle again. Start the journey, empty the electricity tank, empty the batteries with that journey. And then once we've done that, lo and behold, the same warning comes up. So effectively, Herbie has got stuck on just using electricity. So whereas, although he should be a hybrid car, he's become a one fuel car relying on electricity. And that means we never get to use the fuel. There's almost like a barrier to us using the petrol in the tank. And because Herbie isn't designed to be used like that, that persistent use of electricity starts then causing secondary problems. Warning signs start appearing on the dashboard, indicating that all sorts of other things are going wrong. Now, let me move this analogy back to the human hybrid. Humans do have a choice of two fuels. We can use sugars for fuel, or we can use fats. So there's our hybrid human. We can use sugar, or we can use fat. And both and either of these can be used to derive energy for our body to function. We can use sugar and we can use fat to derive energy. And the relativities, like I mentioned for Herbie, for sugar, we've typically got 2,000 to 3,000 calories tucked away in sugar in various forms, starch and sugar, as ready reserves of energy. But even in a lean individual, we've got probably at least 20,000 calories and possibly several times that available in your fat reserves. So there's the relativities of sugar reserves versus fat reserves in the body. And I want you to imagine, just as Herbie could go wrong, so we too can go wrong. We can get stuck onto this cycle of only ever using sugar. When the sugar reserves have gone, the fuel tank says empty, warning lights appear, we go and refuel on sugar and we stay burning the sugar, never really touching the fat reserves. In the same way Herbie could go wrong, we go wrong. And similarly, in the same way Herbie goes wrong, we start then getting these warning signs on the dashboard. These warning signs on the dashboard that something is going wrong because we're staying in the wrong fuel, we're staying in one fuel source all the time. And in the human analogy or in the human situation, these warning signs are those conditions we were talking about before: obesity, type 2 diabetes mellitus, that's the abbreviation I'll tend to use for diabetes, because that's the acquired diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and high blood pressure. So there are warning signs on the dashboard of our hybrid human when we get stuck in sugar burning and not really venturing into the realms of fat burning. So that was my analogy to set the scene. Now let's talk about where insulin fits in with all of this. When we talk about Herbie the hybrid car, effectively, although I didn't use the phrase, there is a switch that tells Herbie when to switch from burning electricity to burning petrol. And when Herbie went wrong, it was this switch that had gone wrong. As soon as the electricity was gone, rather than switching to petrol, the dashboard said, no, car's empty, go and get some more energy. Well, in the human, again, we've got sugar and fat burning. There's a switch that determines which mode we're in. Are we in sugar burning mode or fat burning mode? And that switch I'm going to call insulin. So it's insulin that seems to control that switch from sugar to fat or from fat to sugar in terms of energy burning. I'm going to make a point at this stage that of course is a simplification. It's a rather more complex story, but I'm hoping it's a useful simplification in the sense that it allows me to convey the story and explain some of the key concepts of the story. If I get a little bit of time later, I might talk about some of the ways in which this is a simplification, talk about some of the aspects, but certainly for the moment, let's keep it simple. Let's consider insulin to be our switch. So, starting with insulin, let's talk about insulin. Let's talk about what it does in the body. Now, if we eat carbohydrates, what do I mean by carbohydrates? Carbohydrates, as demonstrated in the pictures here, are things like grains and cereals. This lower picture, we've got pasta, we've got, looks like cereals, we've got some bread, we've got some look like crackers over there. These are the grains and the cereals, all of which provide starch, which is a form of carbohydrate. The upper picture, we've got fruit and vegetables. We've got quite a selection of fruits on the left-hand side, and got some peppers there, some vegetables there. On the right-hand side, we've got the green vegetables. We've got some of the green fruit as well. They provide some starches, so things like the peppers and the apples provide sugars and starches. But also we've got some fiber as well. Some of these green vegetables produce a lot of fiber. They're all forms of carbohydrate. If we eat, or when we eat carbohydrate, we have enzymes that break that carbohydrate down into individual little chemicals. They're called monosaccharides, but essentially they are like the building blocks that make up those carbohydrates. And it's like a glorified large Lego set. So we have glucose molecules. That's one of the type Lego bricks that we have. We have glucose molecules that make up each of these carbohydrates. And what these carbohydrates are long chains of these glucose molecules. So like this Lego set, we've stuck together quite a lot of these glucose molecules to make the carbohydrates in these foods. When we eat those foods, our digestive enzymes break them down into their individual Lego blocks, the glucose molecules. There are others, but glucose is one of the main ones. And then the glucose is then a small enough molecule, once digestion has broken it down into glucose, it's small enough to be absorbed into our blood. So those glucose molecules become blood sugar, blood glucose. Once the glucose is in the blood, it can get transported around the body, and that's when the body, tissues of the body that need glucose can then take the glucose from the blood. The problem is having glucose in the blood for too long, having elevated blood in the glucose for too long, is not a good thing. Glucose starts attaching itself to protein molecules and membranes on the outsides of cells. And if it starts doing that too often, we get secondary consequences, which metabolically are not good. So we've got a very clever and sophisticated, but simple as well, switching mechanism to try and sort this out. Part of the brain called the hypothalamus monitors the level of sugar in the blood. It monitors other things as well, but one of the things it monitors is the level of sugar in the blood. And when the blood glucose level, the blood sugar level, rises above a certain threshold value, the hypothalamus signals to the pancreas to release a hormone to then cause the blood, or cause the sugar in the blood to be reduced. So the insulin is released by the pancreas, and the action of insulin causes glucose to move out of the blood vessels into the tissue cells, where it's used, but critically, it's therefore reduced the level of sugar in the blood. So insulin is a good hormone for controlling blood sugar levels. And when there's insulin around, as part of that process of using up sugar, it switches our body into sugar burning mode. So once insulin's around, like when Harvey's in the electric running mode, once we're in insulin running mode, we will burn glucose and we will switch off our fat burning mechanisms, just as Serby switched off his petrol burning mechanisms. When insulin's done its job and insulin starts passing out of the body and we don't get insulin levels in the body can then switch to its fat burning mode. Again, remember that's a simplification, but for the purposes of today, it's probably going to be a good working model. So when there's insulin in your body, we're in sugar burning mode. When there's no insulin in the body, we're in fat burning mode. So there are two modes. And being in an insulin-driven sugar burning mode is good because it helps us keep our blood sugar level maintained when we've eaten a meal that's full of sugar. Okay, so let's look at a graph. They always say every time you put a graph in a presentation, it reduces your audience by 10%. There's going to be quite a few graphs. So, but I think it seemed to work okay earlier when I gave the talk. So let me talk about, first of all, the sugar graph that we get from eating carbohydrates. Imagine if you've eaten a meal with some carbohydrate in it, and we, over time, measure what that does to your blood glucose level. Well, you get a curve not dissimilar to this. Features of this curve, well, we start off with what we call a resting glucose level in our blood. When we eat our carbohydrate, as we digest it and we absorb the small Lego brick molecules, those molecules pass into the blood, so we start getting a rise in the blood sugar level. But at some point, the pancreas has been triggered, it's released the insulin starts doing its job, and so what then happens is the blood sugar level starts falling. And as the insulin carries on doing its job, the blood sugar level continues to fall until eventually it should plateau. If the blood sugar mechanism is working fine, we return back to our resting sugar level here, and we've gone through this nice sugar curve. It goes up because we've eaten some sugar, but because insulin kicks in and does its job, the sugar curve comes down. If I also plot a similar curve for what our insulin does, it would be probably very similar in shape. So here we've got an insulin curve. Doesn't matter where it is on the up or down scale of the axis, but it mirrors pretty much the same as the sugar curve because it's a response to the sugar curve. The sugar, once there's a slight lag, the sugar level has to start rising in the blood a little bit, and the pancreas is triggered via the action of the hypothalamus. And then we get this curve of insulin produced, and then that peaks when after the blood sugar is peaked, and then the insulin starts disappearing from the body as it's done its job because the blood sugar has returned back to its resting level. So we get this insulin curve in response to our sugar curve. Eating carbohydrate causes an insulin curve. And whilst over there is insulin in the body, remember insulin is this hypothesized switch that moves us into sugar burning mode. Whilst we've got insulin in the body, we will be burning glucose. Now, what if you were to be someone who eats carbohydrate quite regularly throughout your day? In other words, there's lots of eating events, all of which bring carbohydrate into your body, all of which will trigger an insulin curve. Well, of course, if you time your meal so your insulin curve has never barely recovered before the next one starts, you will never come out of this sugar burning mode. You will always stay in your sugar glucose burning mode. So having these repetitive insulin curves will leave you in your glucose burning mode, just as we had Herbie staying in his electrical burning mode because there's a problem with the switch. If we have problems with our insulin switch because we're triggering it all the time, we will stay in insulin burning. So that was insulin in action and already beginning to give you the insights into what goes wrong when insulin goes wrong. So let's talk about insulin resistance. Let's talk about what happens when insulin doesn't work quite as it should. So there was a little recap diagram. Remember, when insulin comes into the body, it's been released by the pancreas, it causes glucose to move out of your blood. It reduces your blood sugar level. Well, how does it do that? Well, the insulin does that because it talks to many cells in the body. In fact, most cells in the body have some direct or indirect response to insulin. And once insulin's in the system, it sends its signal, and cells, and I've identified 5 types of tissue here. We've got the liver, the kidneys, the brain, the fat cells in the skin, and the muscles. Once insulin's in the system, insulin talks to the cells in each of these systems, in each of these tissues, and that message from insulin via these receptors. So each of these organs, they have on the cells, in the cells of these organs, they have receptors. They have special places that pick up the insulin message, like ears for the insulin signal. So the cells in the liver, the cells in the muscles, the cells in your fat, they have these insulin receptors on the surface of the cells. And so once insulin is in the system, those receptors pick up that message, and each of the cells in the liver, the muscles, the fat cells, the brain, they then know what to do with glucose and take glucose out of the blood and start doing something with it. So that's the way, in a very high level, insulin works in the body. The insulin cells, or the cells in the body, have insulin receptors that pick up the insulin message. Now let's look at an typical insulin response curve for somebody during the day. So let's say this person is going to eat carbohydrate quite a few times during the day. Let's say they have toast and cereal for breakfast. That's going to bring about an insulin curve because the carbohydrate's in the toast and the cereal. Let's say mid-morning they have a snack. Let's say the snack is maybe a couple of biscuits, again carbohydrate. Another carbohydrate event, it's going to cause another insulin curve. Let's say now lunch they have some sandwiches, maybe a bit of fruit. Again, that's all delivering carbohydrates, so there's another insulin response curve. Mid-afternoon, there might be a slice of cake or a bit more fruit. Nonetheless, there's still carbohydrate. We get another insulin curve. The evening meal might be pasta or potato or rice and other things that deliver, root vegetables that deliver carbohydrates. We get a nice insulin curve there. And there might be a little bit of a snack later on in the evening, could be a bit of chocolate or a biscuit again with a little bit more carbohydrate. So because we had 6 carbohydrate eating events there, we've got 6 insulin curves on that individual during the day. Notice the size of the curve is probably dependent on how much carbohydrate was in the meal. So here was a snack, which was a lower curve than probably a lunch that was probably a lot more bread, maybe a bit more fruit. So the size of the curve is dependent on how much sugar you've eaten. And the bigger the curve, the longer it takes to recover. So here's a short peaky curve because it was the mid-afternoon snack. Here's a sort of a longer curve to subside. Here's another one, which is the evening meal, because there was more sugar, there was more insulin produced. But let's say you do that every day. On my first talk I gave an example of a day's worth of food that was not at all an unreasonable profile of day's food, but within that day there was something like 400 and 420 grams worth of sugar, which is a lot of carbohydrate. Imagine doing that day in, day out. Well, what happens is if you start doing that day in, day out, those receptors on the cells of each of these tissues start getting a little bit deaf to the insulin message, a little bit immune to it. So the insulin has to shout rather more to get its message across. So the receptors for insulin on the surface of your cells, say in the liver or in the kidneys or in the brain, start getting deaf to the message. And so therefore we've got to send out more insulin. The pancreas has to produce more insulin to get its message across. And when that happens, that's what we call insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is when you get this situation where the receptors on the cells that should be listening to the insulin message get deaf. They've heard the message so often, they've got slightly immune to the message from insulin. They start getting deaf. And so your body has to respond. The body has to get the insulin message across because it's the thing that's dealing with the excess sugar. So we have to produce more insulin. The pancreas has to produce more insulin to get the message across. And when that happens, because we've got to produce more insulin to get the message across, as we get more deaf with the insulin curves get bigger. They get higher up this graph. And as we get even more insulin resistant, the curves go higher up the graph again. And you'll notice because the curves have got bigger, there's a longer time for the levels to come down. And even beyond a certain point, even overnight, your insulin levels may not have fully recovered because there was so much insulin during your eating day. So the consequence of your insulin receptors getting deaf to the message of insulin is we start throwing more insulin out. And that, if you remember, was a response because we were eating a lot of carbohydrate. Well, here's some real data looking at a graph of estimated carbohydrate consumption for the last million years of, it's not been Homo sapiens all that time, but Homo erectus and Homo sapiens during that period. And from the archaeological Paleolithic record, we believe it's about typically 18% of the human diet has been comprised from carbohydrates. But if you look at the last 10,000 years, notice how condensed the scale is because I'm representing a million years across this whole scale here. If you look at the last 10,000 years, it's really begin to shut up. So whereas we were normally 18%, we've now 50, 60, maybe more percent. And that corresponds to the last 10,000 years of agriculture as carbohydrate has become a bigger part of our diet. Now, that's not all a bad thing, of course, because agriculture allowed communities to be no longer nomadic. We could start setting up population centers and communities, and that allowed us probably to develop as a species, but it did bring a lot more carbohydrate into our diet. This upper graph here is looking at the last 50, 60 years of the human diet. The scale has changed. It's now grams per day of carbohydrate. This was percentage of the diet calories coming from carbohydrate. This scale here is your grams of carbohydrate in the diet. And you'll notice there's a very steep rise in this graph. The axis starts at 350, goes up to 500. Notice there's an inflection point. There's a point here where the graph suddenly gets a lot steeper. And you may remember from my first talk we did here that coincides with the introduction of the dietary guidelines for Americans, which really started to advocate the increased consumptions of grains and cereals. And so this is a graph that confirms that we did what the dietary guidelines told us. They told us to eat more grains and cereals, and we did start eating more grains and cereals, more carbohydrates. So the carbohydrate graph has been going ever upward, and particularly steeply upward in the last 20 or 30 years. And so when we look at our insulin curve graph, we've certainly got the evidence that we have been eating a lot more carbohydrate regularly in our days, and that is causing, therefore, many more spikes in the insulin curves. There are two consequences of all these spikes in the insulin curves. One is called compensatory hyperinsulinemia, and the other is called hyperglycemia. Now, quite sophisticated terms, but they're fairly intuitive to understand because they've got the clue in each of the words. So hyperinsulinemia means increased levels of insulin in the blood. Hyperglycemia means increased levels of glucose in the blood. And compensatory hyperinsulinemia is this idea because the cells or the listening stations on the cells or the listening stations that should be listening to insulin are getting deafer to the message of insulin, we are having to, in compensation, produce more insulin to get the message across. So compensatory hyperinsulinemia is this idea that, yes, because the cell receptors are getting desensitized to the message of insulin, we're pumping out more insulin to get the message across. And because the insulin isn't as instantly effective as it should be, we're getting periods where there is more glucose in the blood. We're eating a meal with carbohydrates, that's putting glucose in the blood. The insulin is not meeting the task that it should be straight away, so we get longer periods with raised glucose in the blood. So compensatory hyperinsulinemia and hyperglycemia are your two big metabolic consequences of insulin resistance. So they are the two things that we talk about at a very specific level that are the features of this condition called insulin resistance. And when we've got too much insulin in the body and too much glucose in the body, our metabolism is hugely impacted. And I'm now going to show you a whole series of conditions, illnesses, chronic illnesses, that are, from our understanding now, and it's very interesting research in the last 15 years or so, we are seeing strong causative relationships between there being too much insulin and too much glucose in the blood and these conditions. And also on this list, we've got cancer. We've got three types of cancer in particular: prostate cancer, breast cancer, and colon cancer. All of the conditions here have mechanisms that are consistent with raised glucose and raised insulin levels in the body. So having those two conditions seem to be correlated with all those chronic disorders that I showed you. And it's an interesting question here. We need insulin, we need glucose. So why is it something we need? If there's too much of it, it becomes a problem. So yes, you need some insulin, yes, you need some glucose. In the right amount, it's fine. It's what we evolved to need and use. But if there's too much, we are then going to get metabolic problems. And it's a key part of this journey to start understanding some of those problems. Well, let's go back to Herbie. And one of the problems with having too much glucose in the blood is similar to Herbie having an electrical short circuit, if you like, in either his battery or his electric motor. Imagine when he's using electricity, it's giving off sparks. Now, those sparks might be, to start with, relatively harmful. You might just feel them as a small static shock every time you open or close the door, or they could become more serious, more potential to give yourself a serious little shock from the sparking of the electrical circuits. Well, in a similar way, the human body burning sugar gives off these little sparks, and we call them reactive oxidative species, And the oxidative may sort of ring a bell. You've probably heard of antioxidants. What antioxidants do help your body deal with oxidative species. So when your body burns sugar for energy, it releases these ROSs, these oxidative species. Now, burning a little bit of sugar and giving off a few reactive oxidative species is a good thing. A little bit of that is good for us because it stimulates all sorts of repair and maintenance processes in the body. And normally we've got the antioxidant levels to stop it getting too rampant. So it's a normal part of bodily function. But if we produce them too much and too often, it starts being a significant problem. Those oxidative species set off events that now cause inflammatory processes in the body and not so controlled inflammatory processes. And that then causes certainly a number, if not many, of the conditions I showed you on that previous slide. So sugar burning is not clean. It produces these oxidative species. So if we rely too heavily on sugar burning, we have too many of those floating around in the body. Fat burning, by contrast, doesn't produce those oxidative species. It's a clean energy. So actually, rather perversely, this is the opposite way around to my analogy. We envisage electric energy in a car as the clean energy and petrol as the dirty energy. It's the other way around in the human body. The sugar energy is the dirty one, and the burning of the fat is the cleaner energy for the human body. So when we burn in the body, sugar in the body, and rely on there being too much insulin because we're relying too much on burning the sugar, we have problems. And one of the problems that comes also from insulin resistance is that the cells in the body, the receptors on the cells in the body, do not become resistant at the same rate. And this is an interesting observation that's become clearer in the last 10 years or so of research, is that, for example, the receptors, the insulin receptors on liver cells and the insulin receptors on brain cells are more prone in many people to becoming insulin resistant quicker than the insulin receptors on kidneys, the fat cells in your skin, or your muscle cells. So we get a differential rate of development of insulin resistance. And that in itself begins to create problems. Let's look specifically at the liver. So here I've got a liver functioning normally, and one of the functions that takes place in the liver normally is that the liver can convert fat into sugar. It's a normal process that happens, so it's a natural part of the processing of the liver. When insulin comes into the equation, that process gets switched off. And of course, that makes a lot of sense because insulin should only come about because you've eaten some sugar. Remember, the hypothalamus notices that. It sends the signal to the pancreas releases the insulin, and then the liver cells pick up the message of insulin. And because there was sugar that triggered that whole sequence, the liver says, oh, there's no point making any sugar now because I've just eaten some. So it switches off that process that converts fat into sugar. Now, imagine the liver now has got insulin resistant. So now the liver does not notice the message of insulin when it first arrives. So it carries on producing sugar from fat because it's not initially heard the message from the insulin. And of course, that's a problem. We've already raised the blood sugar level because we've eaten some sugar. That's what triggered the insulin in the first place. But because the liver's slow on the uptake of the message of insulin, it's actually still making more of its own sugar. So we've got a double whammy here. We've increased the blood sugar level because we've eaten sugar, but the liver's churning away, producing more sugar, adding to the problem. Eventually, of course, the insulin does get the message. And actually, when insulin gets the message, not only does it switch off the process of converting fat into sugar, it reverses the process. It converts sugar back into fat. So some or much of that excess sugar it was churning away, it can turn back into fat. So eventually, when the liver gets the message, it will start to address the situation, take sugar out of the blood and convert it into fat. But there's a problem. Because we are in insulin mode, we've got lots of insulin floating around, we can't be in fat burning mode. Remember, insulin in my simplistic model is the switch. Insulin being around switches is from fat burning to sugar burning. Because there's insulin, we can't be fat burning. So we've made all this extra fat, but we're not going to be able to burn it. So the body has very little alternative other than to put it in storage. And this, hopefully, now you can see, is the road to being overweight, overfat, and eventually leading to obesity with insulin resistance, because we're producing a lot of fat, the liver's producing a lot of fat, and it can't burn it, so it's got to put it in storage. And what's interesting with regard to the storage situation is that in many people, the fat gets stored around primarily the liver, but other internal organs as well. And so we get what we call non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We get fat accumulating around the liver, which affects its function. You can get alcoholic fatty liver disease, of course, but this is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And what's very interesting in terms of people's development of insulin resistance is whether your body decides to put the extra fat around the vital organs or send it to the fat cells underneath your skin seems to be determined by genetics, lifestyle choices, not just diet. So some people will tend to store their fat around their internal organs. Some will tend to store it in the fat cells under the skin. Those that store it in the fat cells under the skin, those are the people where you'll notice they look overweight. You'll notice the obesity when it develops. Those people where it's being stored around the internal organs, you won't notice so much, because it's around the internal organs. So what's interesting from my personal story, remember my story about the smoothies and the sugar crash every day? Maybe I was heading towards insulin resistance. My sugar metabolism wasn't right. And maybe my genetic disposition is I store fat around my internal organs. So that when I took sugar out of my diet, I lost a lot of fat, but it wasn't the visible fat that's around my skin or close to the surface of my skin. It was actually the fat around my internal organs. So my waist size didn't change much, but I did lose quite a bit of body fat. And that's probably just as much genetic as it is anything else. My dietary choices prior to that point had caused it actually to accumulate, but my genetic disposition decided where that fat was going to accumulate. So in terms of the story here, what's interesting is we can account for this in terms of the relative rates at which the fat cells in the skin become insulin resistant. If somebody although the liver cells have become insulin resistant quite quickly, if the fat cells under the skin haven't become insulin resistant, the fat cells under the skin are listening to the insulin message. They're not deaf to it, they're listening. And one part of the message is start absorbing the fat that's in circulation. So the fat cells under the skin say thank you very much and absorb all this fat, and so the fat becomes absorbed where you will see it, superficially under the skin. And that's in people whose fat cells don't become insulin resistant. If, however, your disposition is that your fat cells do become insulin resistant quite quickly, just like the liver's deaf to the message, so your skin cells are. So they're not picking up all this extra fat. It just stays in circulation. And so therefore, that is when it's more likely to end up being stored around your internal organs. So whether you become fat superficially or fat around your internal organs might well be a genetic disposition related to the speed at which your fat cells become insulin resistant or don't become insulin resistant. And we've got a term that's being increasingly used for individuals who start storing their fat preferentially around their internal organs rather than around the skin fat cells. Thin on the outside, fat on the inside, TOFI. So TOFI individuals, they don't necessarily look overweight or fat, but actually they might still be carrying quite a lot of fat, but it's this internal, we call it visceral fat, around the visceral organs, the internal vital organs. So your story of insulin resistance is a complex story because the fact that insulin resistance has started is a problem because it throws more insulin in your blood and more glucose in your blood, but it's very much dependent at the relative rates at which different parts of your body develop that insulin resistance. And a lot of the conditions on this chart, we now understand mechanistically, either from the high levels of glucose or the high levels of insulin, or the relative rates of development of insulin resistance in the different tissues of the body. So, for example, let me look at the two itises, tendonitis and osteoarthritis, both inflammatory conditions. Those are caused by the excess glucose. What's interesting, tendons have receptors or have doorways in their cell membranes, the cells of tendons, that allow glucose in without needing insulin. So if your body has too much glucose floating around, the tendons tend to preferentially pick up some of that glucose. And because glucose burning is inflammatory, produces reactive oxidative species, people who get tendonitis, inflammation in the tendons, may be people who've got excess levels of blood glucose, which might be a sign that they've developed insulin resistance. Development of insulin resistance in the brain cells and changing the metabolism of the brain cell, the balance between fat metabolism and sugar metabolism, may be your predetermining factor as to whether you develop dementia or Alzheimer's, where you've got an altered sense or altered mechanism of sugar versus fat metabolism. 25% of your body's cholesterol reserves, for example, sit in the brain. So if you've got altered fat metabolism there because of insulin resistance, that is very likely to cause a disturbance of your brain function. So, and also I mentioned it particularly on the first of these presentations, having high levels of glucose in your blood and altered insulin levels does affect your body's immune system. And how your immune system is functioning is put to the test as soon as an infection, pandemic type infection like COVID-19 comes along. It will find those people with a weaker immune system. And I say a weaker immune system could have been another green box, as I've got on the table here, of those conditions that come with insulin resistance. So there's my my slide. Here's a slide from one of the nutrition courses I've done from Professor Tim Noakes, listing conditions that have all been found to have correlates and causative mechanisms with impaired insulin and impaired glucose levels in the body. You see, it's a real who's who of conditions. There's all sorts on there. There's autism, there's retinopathy, so retinal conditions, ulcerative colitis. What else we've got? We've got PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, various forms of cancer, a few more than I had on my list. We've got rheumatoid arthritis, osteoporosis, and so on. So a lot of the common chronic conditions of the 21st century have a very strong correlate with insulin resistance. So the high prevalence of these conditions in the population is probably an indicator that there's a high prevalence of insulin resistance in our population. And in fact, a study that was done a couple of years ago suggested that only 1/8, 12% of all American adults have proper insulin sensitivity. That's like saying the other way around, 88% of Americans therefore have some degree of insulin resistance. That's the scale of the problem we probably have. And it's probably similar in the UK. So there's the insulin resistance story in our sequence. How do you know? How do you know if you are insulin resistant? Well, before I do that, because this is going to be quite key to the understanding of the next slide, is talk about the interchangeability of these terms. I've tended to use the term insulin resistance in this talk because I've talked about it from a mechanism of insulin. It is interchangeable pretty much with the term metabolic syndrome. So having metabolic syndrome and having insulin resistance are sort of the same thing. My sort of comes from the idea that metabolic syndrome is an either or, in the sense that you'll either be assessed to have metabolic syndrome or not have metabolic syndrome. Insulin resistance, though, is a scale. So if you imagine I've got this ascending or descending scale, depending which way you go up or down the scale, at one end of the scale we are insulin resistant, at the other end we are insulin sensitive. And that's obviously the end you want to be on. Insulin resistant is the diseased state. And at some point on this scale is the line. And if you're to the right of the line, you've got metabolic syndrome. If you're to the left of the line, you haven't. So insulin resistance is really sort of a scale. Metabolic syndrome is a point you've reached when you're above, or a situation you've achieved when you've reached or gone beyond a certain point on that scale. So that's the interchangeability of the two terms insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. And here are the specific details. And from a clinical perspective, if 3 or more of these measures, these are the ones in blue, are true in an individual, that individual probably has insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome. You can see we've got a waist measurement. In men, 40 inches, women, 35 inches. If you're more than that, that's one of your markers. Blood pressure, 130/85. If either of those scores is above the number, above 130 or above 85, you've probably, again, or it's another marker which may then contribute to determining whether you've got metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance. Your HDL cholesterol, which is in inverted commas your good cholesterol, i.e. you want that as high as possible. If you've got it less than 40 milligrams per deciliter in men or less than 50 in women, another contributing tick in the box that might indicate you've got metabolic syndrome. Triglycerides. Now, triglycerides are a form of fat. They're carried around in your body in a lipoprotein, VLDLs. And triglycerides are the form of fat. Remember on my slide a few slides ago, I showed the liver making fat from excess sugars. Well, triglycerides are one of the principal fats that they make in that process. So the more of those the liver makes, the more that's indicating you've had too much sugar in your blood. So high triglycerides are an indicator of raised sugar levels in your blood. So if it's above 150 milligrams per deciliter, that's another one of these potential triggers to say you've got metabolic syndrome. And your HbA1c score, HbA1c is a particular form of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein in your red blood cells that carries oxygen. If that gets exposed to glucose too often, it becomes HbA1c. So hemoglobin HB is your normal hemoglobin. Hemoglobin that's been attacked by glucose is HbA1c. And the score, the measure here, is a measure of what proportion of your hemoglobin has been converted into this HbA1c form, how much of it has been attacked by glucose. So the bigger this number, the more often your blood sugar level has been too high. So your fifth marker on this sequence, if your HbA1c is above, and different sources say anything between 5.5 or 5.7, if your score is above that number, that's your fifth potential trigger to say you've got metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance. As it becomes more available, maybe this fifth score might actually become your resting or fasting insulin level. So whereas we've traditionally taken a fasting blood glucose score, you don't eat overnight, go to the doctors the following morning, have a blood sample taken, and they measure the glucose in that. That's not a reliable measure of your insulin mechanism. However, if you were to have a similar test, but it measured your insulin levels, that probably be even more reliable measure than your HbA1c. But at the moment, they are your indicators. And if you go to the doctors, you have those things measured. Obviously, one of them you can measure yourself with a tape measure, but the other four are blood-borne. Actually, that's not blood-borne, that's a sphygmomanometer. But these three here all rely on blood samples being taken. Then you get a measure of, if 3 or more of those are true for you, you probably have metabolic syndrome. What I would say is, in the absence of those blood measures, if you've got familial history of several or more of these, then there's probably an indication that certainly the genetic disposition for insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome runs in your family. So without the necessary or the detail of those blood tests, you might have some indicators already that maybe you have a genetic disposition to the condition. So that's how you know, or how you might think that is going to be used. Remember, the whole point of this part of the talk was to say dietary change isn't just about weight loss. And I'm shown here that a carbohydrate-based diet can cause this thing called metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance. And metabolic syndrome is then a correlate cause of so many of those chronic conditions of the 21st century. And if, as this story goes, it's caused by eating carbohydrate in your diet, is there therefore a way of bringing about a change, an improvement in your metabolic health? This is what I'm now going to talk about, dietary change. So having gone through the journey about what is metabolic syndrome, what can we do about it? Now, this may be an overdramatic picture of a coffin, but essentially the question I'm asking, once you've got metabolic syndrome, is that it? And if you're on the way to getting metabolic syndrome, becoming insulin resistant, can you do anything about it? Well, the answer is evidently, very evident, you can. The analogy with a car, though, breaks down at this point, because to fix the car where the switch has gone wrong, really you've got to go to a mechanic and he's got to either replace the switch or fix the switch, in the same way as perhaps if you went to a doctor, you went and had a drug or surgery. That's not going to work. It works for Herbie, but it's not going to work for us. What does work for us is the dietary intervention of taking out sugar. It's essentially saying to your body, I'm not going to give you any sugar anymore. The body will then learn that it has to start burning fat. So that's where the analogies move apart. We can train our body to do the right thing. And this is a book. It's when I do a live version of these talks, I wave this book around. It's probably one of the most expensive books I've ever bought, but it's a collation of academic papers of clinicians who've actually used dietary change to bring about change to conditions which are related to metabolic syndrome. Ketogenic diet is the term we give to diets which are low in carbohydrate. We call them that because if you're not burning carbohydrates for energy, you're burning things called ketones, ketone bodies. They are fat derived, and so a ketogenic diet is a diet that encourages your body to burn these ketone bodies. So it's a ketogenic diet. So that's another way of saying diets where they're taking carbohydrate out of the diet. And metabolic therapies to bring about improvements in metabolic health. And in this particular worthy tome, there are papers looking at how these diets have been used to help resolve epilepsy, Parkinson's, obesity, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, migraine, mood disorders, autism, and various forms of cancer, including brain tumors. So we've got this collection of papers where they have proven that by bringing about the dietary change brings about improvement in metabolic health. The two papers I'm going to focus on are quite seminal papers, I believe. The first one was the first real paper to do this in a very strictly controlled clinical environment, measuring the sort of things I mentioned a few slides ago, those blood measures and the blood pressure and so on, very specific measures. Well, the first study I'm going to talk about measures those before and after a dietary change. And the second paper, on a similar vein, but in a more general result sense, just saying how dietary change can be more effective than pharmaceutical intervention. First of all, the first paper here, the paper by Volek and Finney, where they basically took two groups of people with markers of metabolic syndrome. Half of them, they gave them a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, so a conventional diet for losing weight, the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. The other half, they gave a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. And they followed them. It was only for sort of about 12 to 18 weeks, I think, in this study here. And then they measured the key markers before and after the intervention. And here is the graph. The graph slightly for me is the wrong way around, because the right-hand side of the graph is actually measuring things that have reduced in the patients, and the left-hand side are things that have increased. And to me, that's slightly the wrong way around. So just make that point. And we've got the two colors for the two diets. The red markers, the red lines, are where we've got the people on the high carbohydrate, low fat diet. The yellow markers are where we've got people on the low carbohydrate, high fat diets. And notice the proportions on the low carb, high fat. It's about 60% fat, 60% of the calories coming from fat and 12% coming from carbohydrate, the rest coming from protein. And that fits roughly with the pie charts I showed on last week's talk, looking at the low carbohydrate diets. And if we look at this graph here, we've got all of the key markers here. We've got this one here, abdominal fat, or these two, abdominal fat and body mass. You'll notice both on the yellow diet, the low carbohydrate diet, the body mass reduction, remember it's all reductions on this side of the graph, body mass reduction and abdominal fat reduction are much better than on the red low fat diets. If we look at insulin levels, again, the insulin levels fell. They fell on both diets, but the fall was much more significant on the low carbohydrate diet. We've got triglycerides. Remember, these are the fats the liver produces in response to excess sugar. Those levels fall significantly more on the low carbohydrate diet than the low fat diet. HDL, that went up. That's the good cholesterol. That's the one we want to go up. That went up on the low carbohydrate diet. It actually went down a little bit on the low fat diet. And saturated fatty acids, they were reduced in the body, the circulation fatty acids. So we've got this low carbohydrate, high fat diet metabolically or improving all these metabolic markers that we use in the first place to determine or show that someone has got metabolic syndrome. So this was the first seminal study in many ways that showed with dietary change and in relatively short order. So this was about 12 to 18 weeks. There were significant measurable improvements in these key parameters. That's the first of those studies. Second one, study by two practicing clinicians, Mark and Dutoit. They similarly took patients and moved them onto low carbohydrate diets. But rather than looking at the numbers, let me look at the descriptions or the words from one of the authors of the paper, Dr. Dutoit. As a physician, you give prescriptions every month for chronic conditions and you don't see any improvements in health. Actually, things often tend to get worse over time. So we asked the question, as physicians practicing recommended guidelines, why aren't we seeing the desired improvements in health? Why is evidence-based medicine not working? So we started these group-based lifestyle interventions with obese, pre-diabetic and diabetic patients and tracked patient outcomes with the use of electronic medical data records. Practice-based evidence. And what we found was that participants' health improved. They reduced their need for medication and their control from that medication improved. So again, not looking at the numbers, looking at the summary conclusion by one of the physicians there, they were finding that in their clinical practices, rather than prescribing more drugs, prescribing a low carbohydrate diet made the medications they had more effective, but generally also reduced the level of medications those patients needed. So that's compelling evidence that dietary change is going to make a difference. And there's three strands of dietary change I'm going to talk about to conclude today's talk. Cutting your carbohydrate. I've sort of addressed that already, but I'll just wrap that up a little bit. I'll look at, if you are going to eat carbohydrates, can you be a bit smarter about the carbohydrates you eat? And also looking at when you eat, time-restricted eating. So let's take up this one first, cutting carbohydrate intake. Well, you remember, if we eat carbohydrate, we get a blood sugar curve from that. That then generates an insulin curve. And if we eat carbohydrate all the time, we get these continuing insulin curves. And that switches us out of fat burning and puts us into carbohydrate burning. And therefore, if we cut the carbohydrate in our diet, we will then take away those insulin curves and improve our health. So remember the sequence of events with carbohydrate. If you eat carbohydrate, it's broken down into the Lego building blocks. Those Lego building blocks are then absorbed into the blood and we get blood sugar. If you take the sugar out of your diet, the first thing you don't need to worry about is you won't run out of sugar. Your liver will produce the sugar your body needs. Remember on my slide, quite a few slides ago now, that one of the things that happens in your liver before insulin comes along is your body will convert fats into glucose, into blood sugar. Your liver will carry on doing that. And your liver will produce all the sugar your body needs. So whereas your body does need protein, you have to eat protein. You do need fat, your body has to eat fat. You do need a certain amount of sugar, but you don't need to eat it because the liver will make it. So actually your dietary requirement for carbohydrate is actually zero because your liver will make what your body needs. It's quite hard to be zero, almost impossible, I'd say, but you would not die if you cut all the carbohydrate out of your diet. You would if you cut all your protein, you would if you cut all your fat, and you would if you cut your vitamins and your minerals and all those extra nutrients, those micronutrients. But carbohydrate, no, you would not die if you cut carbohydrate. So one of the simplest things is certainly to reduce your carbohydrate. I say it's fairly drastic to cut it completely. But in that book of collated papers, there were some people with some really quite desperate conditions, terminal brain tumours, and they found by drastic, almost complete elimination of carbohydrate, they didn't stop the cancers, but they gave the patients much longer life expectancy and the better quality of life during those latter years or months of their lives. So the more incentive to cut, the more they can cut. Taking the pragmatic approach that it might be quite tricky to cut carbs completely, can we be a bit clever about the carbs we do eat? Well, I've got three curves here, sugar curves, blood sugar curves, from three sorts of carbohydrates: sugars, starches, and fibre. Now, your sugars are things like your honey, your Tate and Lyle granulated sugars, so therefore sugar in processed foods, and a lot of the sugars in fruits. They are short chains of these Lego bricks. Remember, digestion breaks down the carbohydrate into their individual Lego bricks. They're quite short chains of Lego bricks, so your digestion breaks them down fairly quickly. So they become blood sugar very quickly, so you get a quick spike in your blood sugar level. If you eat a starch like potato, rice, pasta, those chains of carbohydrate molecules are rather longer. So it takes your digestion a little bit longer to break them down into their individual Lego bricks before they can be absorbed into the blood. So the curve you get is later and lower and more spread. And the third type of carbohydrate, a fiber, here the chains of the Lego bricks are so long that actually only minimally can be absorbed. So the spike, or the curve we get here is a lot smoother, a lot lower, and over a longer period of time, because we're breaking down those carbohydrate chains for longer and getting less carbohydrate in the blood because of it. So we've got three types of blood sugar curves depending on whether we're eating sugars, starches, or fiber. And we can embody that concept in something called glycemic index, GI. And those three types of carbohydrate we can call high glycemic index, moderate glycemic index, and low glycemic index. So high glycemic index are your sugars. The higher the number, the quicker the glucose gets into your blood. The moderate, they're sort of middle ground. The low GI numbers, they're where the sugar takes a lot longer or hardly gets into the blood at all. So low glycemic index foods give us these low blood sugar curves. And because, if you remember, we get insulin curves that are like our sugar curves, these different types of carbohydrates give us different insulin curves. So if we go more for the low glycemic index type foods, we will have fewer spikes in our insulin levels. And so that is therefore your strategy if you want to start managing your insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, is if you are going to eat carbohydrates, you steer away from the carbohydrates that are high glycemic index. Of course, I've pictured the good ones there. I would also put table sugar and therefore foods that have got refined sugars in them, like biscuits and cakes and things like that. But I've also, just to hone the point, fruits as well. But fruits like berries have low glycemic index sugars. So blueberries, blackberries, strawberries, and raspberries here in moderation will give you fewer insulin spikes. In terms of vegetables as well, another rule I'd have is that vegetables below the ground, the starchy vegetables, parsnips, potatoes, sweet potatoes, those sort of things, tend to be higher up the glycemic index range, whereas the leafy, above ground parts of the vegetables tend to be towards the lower. They're more like the fiber, the lower glycemic index range. So I'll tend to encourage you to eat the green leafy vegetables, the spinach, the kale, a little bit the broccoli, asparagus, those sort of things, because they're high fiber, much less carbohydrates. They are lower glycemic index than potato, rice, that sort of thing. So in terms of eating carbohydrates and being clever about it, you eat the lower glycemic index carbohydrates. And the final thing is talking about when we eat. Now, you may remember Pauline the Paleo from last week's talk, and I described if she were able to get in a time capsule and suddenly beam herself to the present day, what were the things she would have observed? Well, one of the things she would have observed is we tend to have access, and many people do, eat food all the time. We're grazing. And so the phrase, just because you're awake does not mean you should be eating. And you remember that fits very well with my curves here. I was identifying 6 eating events in the day. I made the assumption here for my insulin curves that each of those eating events brought carbohydrate into the body, and therefore you get all these individual spikes of your insulin. Well, if we take out the carbohydrate and we start cutting down the eating events, we will start to reduce the levels of insulin that our bodies produce. The body gets little insulin rests because we're not giving it carbohydrate all the time. In addition to that, if we condense the hours of the day that we're actually eating, we can get more benefits. So I've got these 2 time-restricted eating strategies. They're called 18-6 and 16-8. By that I mean, on this one on the left here, if you go 18 hours from the last meal of one day until the first meal of the next, and then confine your eating to the next 6 hours. Don't eat continuously during the 6 hours, but what meals you do have are within that next 6 hours. You've done what we call the 18-6 eating pattern. Similarly, the 16-8, just slightly different. You go 16 hours between the last meal of one day and the first meal of the next, and then condense your eating events into 8 hours. That could be 12 till 8 p.m. or 11 till 7 or whatever it might be, and this might be 12 till 6 p.m. eating maybe only 1 or 2 meals in that window, and then you have a longer window without eating. And what that does, first of all, it takes away one of the eating events. Let me assume it takes away breakfast, and then it condenses the remaining 2 eating events, and that in itself will also bring down your insulin response. And remember, to manage your insulin resistance, it's all about bringing down your insulin response. So here's a way of complementing your carbohydrate restriction to bring about a reduction in your insulin response. So what I would say is, if you've had an eating event where you've eaten some carbohydrate, maybe more than you planned to, or you've gone to a party or an event, one way to get you back on track is to engage in these time-restricted eating events to bring the insulin down. Another more extreme form of time-restricted eating is 3-day fasting. We normally talk about 3-day fasting. And the reason we talk about 3-day fasting, if we go back to the human body between the 2 energy sources of sugar and fat, it was a simplification because we actually store something called glycogen, which is sort of like a starch formed from excess sugar. It's still a carbohydrate, and it sits in our muscles and our liver and our other cells of the body as well, to become a fuel source when ready sugar has started to reduce. And it takes probably 24 to 36 hours for your body to burn through both the ready sugar reserves and the glycogen reserves before you'll move into fat burning. So a 3-day fasting, certainly 2 or more days, is what you need to move away from all your sugar reserves and get yourself back into the fat burning zone. And effectively, therefore, what 3-day fasting is doing, it's forcing the switch. It's forcing you to move into fat burning mode. So 3-day fasting is an more extreme form of time-restricted eating. You'd still be drinking water, maybe some salts in that period to help with that, but you're taking away all energy sources, and then your body has to go to fat burning. Remember, you've got 20, 40, 60,000 calories worth of fat in the typical human body. Even a lean individual would have 20,000. That's more than enough for 10, 12 days without any consequences, whereas sugar, 2 to 2.5 to maybe 3,000 calories at most. So you burn that, and then you're onto your fat reserves. So this is me using an example of 3-day fasting is basically forcing the switch. It's fiddling the switch, so you have to move into fat burning mode. And remember, all of those eating strategies, cutting the carbs, cutting your glycemic index, time-restricted eating, is about moving you down this scale of insulin resistance. Remember, higher up the scale, you're more likely to be metabolically compromised. The lower down the scale, the more likely you are to be metabolically healthy. So these 3 strategies are all about improving your metabolic health. Okay, so that was the dietary change aspect. So we looked in the 4 earlier sections, the human hybrid between using carbohydrate and fat as energy sources. Insulin is the key gateway hormone that switches us into sugar burning mode because it's a way of getting rid of excess sugar when we've eaten it. If we eat too much sugar too often, we get into insulin resistance, which is this thing called metabolic syndrome. We've got key correlates with metabolic syndrome, all these other conditions, not just obesity, being overweight, but type 2 diabetes, hypertension, various forms of cancer, inflammatory conditions, mental disorders, all sorts of things correlated. How do you know if you've got metabolic syndrome? I talked about the key metabolic measures, but also familial history is quite important. And then, assuming you have got metabolic syndrome or you're working your way up the scale towards metabolic syndrome, how we can use dietary change to bring about improvement in that condition. So that really was the basis of the talk. I'll just finish with a slide here. Don't think of it as a diet, think of it as a middle management. So you're thinking about managing the fat, either the superficial fat around your tummy, but maybe the fat around your internal organs as well. So you don't have to be fat to be needing to think about dietary change. If you're likely to have metabolic syndrome, family history, or from key blood markers, then maybe you should be changing your diet, improving aspects of your diet to bring yourself down that scale. So there we go. That was my talk. But I'm not fat, the case for dietary change. Apologies, I had to do it again. It may not have been quite as good the second time as the first time I delivered it live, but I think I've got the main points in, and I will see you again soon.